Tonight, we are joined here live at the studio by Atty. Gilbert Andres, the Assistant Executive Director of the Human Rights Advocacy Group Center Law, or Center for International Law, and one of the legal counsels of the families of the Maguindanao Massacre victims. Hi, Attorney. Good evening. Welcome to Y News. Of course, for those who were not aware of what happened 9 years ago, can you please transpire to us what really happened on November 23 of 2009? How many victims were killed?
So there were 58 victims, including 32 journalists who were killed in Sitio Masalay, Barangay Salman, Ampatuan Town, Maguindanao. So it happened in the morning of November 23, which was a Monday. In fact, I have a very vivid recollection of where I was at that time. I was in our law office in Makati, and we just received this report that indeed journalists were being killed there in Maguindanao. So it was a very surreal feeling.
And apparently, part of the convoy were two motorists who were mistakenly identified as part of the convoy, but they were actually witnesses. So who were the first one who stood out as witnesses and pointed out and pinned down the Ampatuans regarding this case?
Actually, during the hearing in January 2010, the first witness that was presented was then NBI director. It was an NBI investigator, and Ricardo Diaz, because the strategy of the prosecution really is to present the investigator who will give a forest view of what happened on November 23, 2009.
What were the strongest evidences collected on the witnesses?
Well, it's really difficult to say that it's the strongest. The prosecution wants to think that every piece of evidence is good evidence for the prosecution. I think the fact that we have witnesses who were actually there during the planning. So we had witnesses who were there during the planning and even during the November 23 incident.
In one of your interviews before, you mentioned that there are about 197 suspects, if I'm not mistaken, and 70 are still at large. Do we know the identities of the 70 other suspects?
In fact, these are known since the accused are really named in the information. So it's still a big question where they are right now. But the point is that the Philippine National Police, as well as the Department of Interior and Local Government, should exert every effort to arrest all the remaining accused who are still at large.
So, regarding the accused ones, what were the main defense that they presented, and how many have been accused at the moment?
Well, I think some of the defenses were alibi, some of the defenses were denials. And as of now, there are actually about 115 who were arrested and arraigned, meaning to say they actually participated in the trial. So, meaning to say there are still about 80 plus who are at large.
Actually, there was one report before that one of the political advisor of Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo during that time mentioned that his name was Gabriel Claudio. He mentioned that they had this agreement in principle saying that no Mangandodatu should run against the Ampatuans. But because he filed the certificate of candidacy, do you think that this triggered the Ampatuans to commit such crime? Do you think that this was the trigger?
Well, I think it was a trigger, but I think the greater point is that it's irrelevant, really, because anyone who wants to file a certificate of candidacy should be able to do so. And the fact that there were actually 32 journalists who were killed in one swoop really sends a very dangerous message that there's a sense of impunity in our country and that life is cheap. And that's really a gross violation of the right to life as well as the right to freedom of expression of our journalists.
How many witnesses do we have right now as of the moment who've presented their evidences?
The prosecution presented about 166 witnesses to prove the information.
Okay, but they mentioned that because we have a large number of witnesses already, this might take about 100 or 200 years. What's your take on this one?
Well, actually, there was already a formal offer of evidence filed by the accused Andal Ampatuan Jr. last November 5, and in fact the prosecution already filed its comment this week to that formal offer. So meaning to say, as for those who were already arrested and arraigned, they have already presented their evidence, and the prosecution already presented its evidence against this arraigned accused. Now, there's only one remaining accused who's presenting, wherein the prosecution is still presenting its evidence against this one accused who's currently detained. This means to say that actually, as for those who were already arrested and detained, there can already be a partial promulgation of judgment, because there are actually peculiar guidelines issued by the Supreme Court with regards to the Maguindanao Massacre. In fact, Center Law calls this first in, first out. Meaning to say, if there's an accused and the prosecution already presented its evidence against that accused, and that accused already presented his defense, then there can actually be partial judgment as to those accused. So first in, first out.
Okay, so are you trying to say that at least we will try to resolve the Maguindanao Massacre within this administration of President Duterte? Are you trying to say that one?
Well, we're hoping. We're hoping. It's really difficult to really give an estimate when will be the promulgation of judgment. But suffice it to say that it's already within the guidelines given by the Supreme Court for the trial court to actually give a partial judgment with respect to those accused who are already arrested and arraigned.
What about the Ampatuans? Where are they right now? Because a lot of are wondering, where are the Ampatuans right now? Are they convicted? Because we know that in 2015, there was one Ampatuan who was granted bail because of weak evidence, right?
It's Sajid Islam, Ampatuan.
That's right. And recently, we saw Zaldi Ampatuan, who was given, I don't know if he was given a furlough because he was seen at the wedding of his daughter. So where are the Ampatuans right now?
Well, they're supposedly inside the Camp Bagong Diwa Detention Center. And if ever they will go out for a furlough, they will have to ask for permission from the trial court. But suffice it to say that they should be detained inside the custodial inside the detention center there in Camp Bagong Diwa.
Okay. In terms of asking furlough, do they also have to ask the consent of the victims of the families in that matter?
Well, the procedure really is they will file for a motion, then the prosecution will file a comment and or opposition.
Okay.
So the victims are really represented by the state because it's really the people against the accused. So,
okay. So with Zaldi Ampatuan, his furlough was given legally by the government to him?
It was granted by the trial court.
Okay. And what's the minimum time that one convicted can go out of the prison?
Well, there's really no minimum time. It's really based on the order of the court. So the court will usually give a window, and any accused who has been granted temporary a furlough should strictly comply with that window.
Do you see any form of acquittal? Let's say, because considering that President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo used to be allies with the Ampatuans, and we all know that the President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo is also ally with the President. So do you see that there is a chance of acquittal on the side of the convicted?
Well, it's really difficult for us lawyers because we're really limited by the sub judice rule.
Okay.
Cannot really say. We cannot really discuss the merits of the case itself. But I think it's safe to say that the prosecution panel thinks that it has presented all the pieces of evidence, all the testimonial evidence it has to present in order to prove the prosecution's case.
One of the Ampatuans, Ampatuan Sr. also died in prison a few years ago. So what happens to his case? The case also dies?
Well, when accused dies, the criminal liability is extinguished by reason of death, but the civil liability still persists, because there's still the estate of the accused who died. So there can still be a decision with respect to the civil liability of that accused.
Okay, let's take a look at the families of the victims right now. Have you spoken recently to the families of the victims? How are they right now? Are they given enough support by the government?
Yesterday, we actually had a commemoration, simple commemoration in front of the National Museum, because our message is that this is in a sense, it's a historical moment. There will be a conviction. And in a sense, the Maguindanao Massacre was one of the darkest periods in our nation's history. So the prayer of our clients really is that this will not anymore be repeated, and that we should say no to impunity. And their general sentiment yesterday was, we have to understand that they are really carrying that burden of losing a loved one, at the same time losing a breadwinner. So every time there's a commemoration, it's like they're reliving again the gruesome tragedy of November 23, 2009. So we hope that there will really be justice served to the victims of the Maguindanao Massacre.
And next year, they will be celebrating the 10th year death anniversary of those who were killed. What are the plans of the family members and the support they're getting from the government? Are they getting enough support from the government as well?
In fact, if I may, I will really ask them, they would rather not have a 10th year commemoration because they'd rather have that there will be a decision, a promulgation of judgment as for those accused who were already arrested and arraigned.
Attorney, we all know that we've heard of media killings, lawyers being killed as well. Do you see any hand in the government when it comes to protecting the media from all these killings right now? Is there such a law to protect the journalists, the lawyers as well? Because, of course, you're not obligated with the clients that you choose to represent. And many of the media people are also scared to write and report things that they've researched about because of the media killings and the killings that's have been happening. So do you see any hand in the government right now that there will be such a protection on this kind of professions?
I think the greatest protection is really in the Constitution. It's in Section 4 of Article 3, that no law shall be passed abridging the right to freedom of expression of the press. And in that sense, if a journalist is killed, that's really the greatest violation of the right to freedom of expression.
Sure.
And it's intrinsic that it's a state obligation to protect the lives of journalists. By really ensuring that any killed journalist should really receive justice in accordance with the rule of law.
On that note, thank you so much, Attorney Gilbert Andres, for joining us this evening. And of course, we send our prayers to the bereaved families of those who were killed in the unfaithful Maguindanao Massacre.